The 38th floor of Whitmore Financial Group smelled like ambition and old money. The kind of money that had never once worried about rent. Nadia Orell had worked there for 4 years, and in 4 years not one person in that building had learned her last name. They knew her as the fat one, the quiet one, the one who always had a granola bar in her desk drawer and never complained when her lunch disappeared from the break room fridge. She was 31 years old, a certified forensic accountant with 2 graduate degrees and a mind that could tear apart a falsified balance sheet the way most people tear open an envelope. Quick, clean, and without hesitation. None of that mattered much when Penelope Ashcroft was standing in the boardroom doorway, looking at Nadia the way people look at furniture they're tired of. "Oh," Penelope said, pausing mid-stride. "You're still here." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even cruel, exactly. It was something worse. It was indifferent. Nadia kept her eyes on her screen. Quarterly audits due Friday. Right. Penelope didn't move. She had the kind of beauty that made rooms go quiet, the kind that had been professionally maintained since approximately age 17. She looked at Nadia's desk. The neat stacks of folders, the 2 empty coffee cups, the cardigan hanging over the back of the chair because Nadia was always cold in buildings where other people were always warm, and something flickered across her face. Not cruelty, just confusion, like she genuinely couldn't understand why a person like Nadia would show up every day to a place like this. "Victor's client arrives at 4, Penelope said finally. "Use the side entrance when you leave tonight. He doesn't like clutter." She left before Nadia could answer. Nadia sat very still for a moment. Then she opened a new spreadsheet, because that's what you do when you're the kind of woman who has learned, over 31 years, that feelings are expensive and spreadsheets are free. Victor Hulse was the managing director of Whitmore Financial Group's private wealth division, and he had the ethics of a man who had never once faced a real consequence. Nadia had known this for approximately 8 months. She had the documentation to prove it for 6. What she hadn't figured out, not yet, was what to do with that information. Because Victor wasn't just managing client portfolio, he was managing portfolios for people whose names appeared in classified federal wiretaps, and Nadia had found the shell companies by accident, chasing a rounding error at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, and now she knew something that made her stomach hurt every time she opened her laptop. The client who arrived at 4 that afternoon did not use the front entrance. He arrived the way men like him always arrived, without announcement, with 2 men flanking him who didn't look like assistants, in a suit that cost more than Nadia's monthly rent and said nothing about it. She saw him from the window of the file room where she'd gone to avoid the lobby entirely, because Penelope's comment had burrowed under her skin the way small cruelties always did. His name, she would learn later, was Callum Dre. Not Callum like the name belonged to a person who had ever been ordinary. Callum like something carved. He was 40, maybe 42, with dark hair gone silver at the temples and the kind of jaw that looked like a decision. The tattoo that ran up the side of his neck disappeared into his collar, and his eyes, even from 3 floors up, even through glass, were the color of the St. Lawrence in February. He stopped on the sidewalk before entering. He looked up, not at the building, at the window, at her. Nadia stepped back so fast she knocked a stack of folders off the shelf. She told herself it meant nothing. Men like that didn't look at women like her. She'd learned that early and learned it well. And she wasn't the kind of person who unlearned things easily. She went back to her desk and finished the quarterly audit and ate her granola bar at 7:15 when the floor was mostly empty. And she didn't think about Callum Dre again until the next morning, when Victor called her into his office and told her, with the particular tone of a man who has already made a decision and is only informing you of it, that she was being transferred to special accounts. "Effective immediately," Victor said without looking up from his phone. "Mr. Dre's holdings are complex. He needs someone detail-oriented. I'm in the middle of a fraud audit," Nadia said. Victor looked up then. He had the eyes of a man who had never found a woman like Nadia interesting, which meant he also never found her threatening, which was perhaps the only advantage she'd ever had in this building. "Leave the big picture to the people equipped to handle it," he said. "Your detail work, Nadia. That's not an insult. It's a job description." She left his office and stood in the hallway for a moment with her hands flat against the wall and her jaw set so tight her back teeth ached. Detail work, 4 years, 2 degrees, 8 months of documented financial fraud sitting in an encrypted folder on her personal drive. Detail work. She went back to her desk. She picked up the Dre file. She started reading. By noon, she understood why Victor had wanted someone meticulous and why he'd specifically chosen someone he didn't think would ask questions. Callum Dre wasn't just a wealthy client. He was the operational head of a criminal organization that stretched from Montréal to Vancouver, with financial tentacles reaching into legitimate businesses across 6 provinces. The Whitmore accounts were a laundering mechanism. Sophisticated, layered, almost beautiful in its construction. The way a trap is beautiful when you're the one who built it and not the one walking into it. The problem was that someone had already walked into it. Nadia found the second set of books on her 3rd day of reviewing the Dre accounts. Victor had been skimming, not aggressively, carefully, the way a man skims when he's afraid of the person he's stealing from. Small percentages, irregular intervals routed through a subsidiary in the Cayman Islands that appeared on paper to be a marine equipment company. Nadia sat back in her chair. Victor Hulse was stealing from Callum Dre, and Nadia Orell now knew about it. She closed her laptop. She opened it again. She looked at the door to Victor's office. Glass, always slightly ajar, the blinds never fully closed, the way men with nothing to hide arrange their spaces to demonstrate exactly that. She thought about Penelope's face in the doorway. Clutter. She thought about 4 years of granola bars and side entrances and being the detail work. She copied the files to her encrypted drive and went to get coffee and stood in the break room for a long time looking at the window while the machine made its sounds. And she thought, I should do nothing. I should go home. I should eat dinner and watch something forgettable and not be the kind of persons this story gets told about. She went back to her desk and kept working. She had been the kind of person this story gets told about her entire life. She might as well start acting like it. The meeting happened on a Thursday. She hadn't asked for it. It had been scheduled by Victor's assistant. Mr. Dre requests a briefing on the Q3 reconciliation, and Nadia had received the calendar invite with the specific clarifying panic of someone who has just realized the things they're standing on is not solid ground. He was already in the conference room when she arrived. The 2 men from the sidewalk were there, positioned near the door in the way that made it clear they weren't there to take notes. Victor was there, sitting at the head of the table with the practiced ease of a man hosting on his own territory, which was, Nadia had come to understand, an illusion. Callum Dre was standing at the window. He turned when she came in. She'd expected him to look past her. The way men like Victor did, the way Penelope did, the way most of the people in this building did when they looked at Nadia Orell, like she was a placeholder for the actual person they were waiting for. He didn't look past her. He looked at her the way you look at something you've been waiting for and didn't expect to arrive like this, without announcement, carrying a laptop bag and wearing a navy cardigan, her dark hair pulled back in the kind of bun that said I was running 5 minutes late this morning and not I was trying to impress anyone. Mrs. Orell, he said. Not a question. Like he'd already read her file. Like he'd known exactly who was walking through that door. Mr. Dre, she said, and was proud of herself for how steady her voice was. She sat down. She opened her laptop. She presented the Q3 reconciliation with the thoroughness of someone who had spent 4 years being underestimated and had long since decided that her work would speak at a volume her voice was never allowed to reach. Callum asked 2 questions. Both of them were precise. Both of them were the exact 2 questions a person would ask if they understood the material at a level that Victor Hulse did not. Victor answered a question nobody had asked and smiled the whole time. After, when Victor had been called away by his assistant with the convenient timing of a man who had arranged to be called away, Callum stood and buttoned his jacket and looked at Nadia with the February River eyes and said quietly, "You found that a question either." Nadia looked at her screen, then at him. "I find all the discrepancies. That's the job." "The Cayman subsidiary," he said. The room went very still. She should have said, "I don't know what you mean." She should have smiled and gathered her things and used the side entrance when she left, the way Victor had instructed, so she didn't become clutter. She should have been the detail work and nothing more. Instead she said, "I don't work for Victor Hulse." Callum Dre was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said. "I'm beginning to understand that." She was escorted from the building that evening by 2 of his men, which was not, it turned out, the threatening thing she'd expected it to be. They were polite. One of them held the elevator door. The car that was waiting outside was warm and the driver didn't speak, and she was taken not to a basement or an airfield but to a private office in a building in Westmount that smelled like wood polish and old books. Callum was already there. "Sit," he said, and then, when she didn't move immediately, "Please," she sat. "Victor has been stealing from me for 14 months, he said. "I've known for 3, then why? Because I didn't know how much he'd already moved and because proof requires precision." He paused. "Your predecessor in this role was a man named Gareth. He found the same discrepancy in 2021. He chose not to document it. What happened to Gareth?" "He retired to Nova Scotia. He is fine." Callum's tone carried the specific patience of a man who has had this conversation before and understands the question behind the question. "I don't punish people for knowing things. I punish people for stealing from me. There's a difference." Nadia looked at her hands, then at him. "Victor's going to know I talk to you. Victor is going to know considerably more than that by morning." "And me?" He looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight, the scar along his jaw was visible, small, old, healed over long ago, but still there, the way old damage always leaves its record. He was the most frightening person she had ever been alone with. He was also, she was aware with the specific clarity of a woman who had spent her life observing things other people missed, the most completely attentive person who had ever looked at her. Not at her cardigan, not at her weight, not at the bun or the laptop bag or the granola bar she'd forgotten was still in her jacket pocket. At her. "You kept documentation," he said. "Yes, encrypted." "Of course." Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. "I'd like to hire you. I already have a job." "You had a job. Victor's going to have you terminated by 9 a.m. when she realizes what's happened." She knew he was right. She'd known since the moment she'd copied those files that there was no version of this where she stayed comfortably in her lane. There never had been. The lane had always been a fiction Victor maintained to keep the detail work from looking at the big picture. "What would the role involve?" she asked. "Finding things," he said. "I'm a forensic accountant." "I know what you are, Nadia." It was the first time he'd used her first name. It landed differently than she'd expected. Not presumptuous, not condescending. Like he'd been waiting to use it correctly and had decided this was the moment. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course." He stood. "I'll have someone drive you home." She stopped at the door. The marine equipment company, the one in the Caymans. Victor ran the disbursements through a personal account at a credit union in Longueuil. "The routing number is in the documentation I have. If you want to recover the full amount, you'll want to move before the quarter closes." Callum Dre stood very still. "That's not in the files you copied," he said slowly. "No," she said. "I remembered it." She left. The next 3 weeks were not comfortable. Victor was removed from Whitmore Financial Group with the speed and thoroughness of a man whose colleagues had been waiting for an opportunity. Nadia's access card stopped working on the Monday morning, which she'd expected. What she hadn't expected was the call from HR informing her that her termination was effective immediately, that her personal items would be boxed and couriered, and that she should not attempt to re-enter the premises. She sat in her apartment in NDG with a cup of tea gone cold and listened to the sound of the building around her. The pipes, the upstairs Erdnab's dog, the distant traffic on Sherbrooke, and thought about the fact that she had, as of this moment, no job, a considerable amount of encrypted evidence of financial fraud, and the business card of a man who ran organized crime across half the country. Her phone rang. "I heard about Whitmore," Callum said. "Word travels. I have a proposal. You mentioned. Not the same one." A pause. "Victor has retained legal counsel. He's going to claim the discrepancies were clerical errors and that you falsified the documentation as retaliation for a performance review." Nadia set down her tea. "I've never had a negative performance review in my life. I know that. You know that." His lawyer is betting a jury won't care. Another pause, quieter. I can make this go away. By doing what? By being considerably less patient with Victor than I've been. I don't want that, Nadia. I want to win, she said. I want to win legitimately. I want a judge and a record and Victor Hulse sitting across from me in a room where his money doesn't protect him. The silence on the other end of the phone was long enough that she wondered if she'd miscalculated. That, Callum said finally, is going to take longer. I know. And more documentation than you currently have. I know that too. Then you'll need access to the accounts you no longer have. She looked at the window, at the grey October sky over NDG, the maples gone rust and gold, the particular light of a Canadian autumn that always made her feel like something was ending and something else hadn't started yet. Are you offering to give me access? She asked. I'm offering to let you do your job, he said. The actual one. The one you've been doing for 4 years while everyone around you called it detail work. She hired a lawyer that afternoon. She called her mother in Sudbury and told her everything, which took 40 minutes and resulted in her mother saying, "You always were too smart for that place," which was both true and not the comfort it was intended to be. She started work for Callum Dre the following Monday. It was not what she'd expected. She'd expected to feel like she was walking into something dangerous. She did, but not in the way she'd anticipated, not the low-grade danger of navigating a hostile office, of Penelope's doorway comments and Victor's particular brand of cheerful condescension. This was different. This was the feeling of being handed something real and being trusted not to drop it. Callum gave her access, all of it. Not just the Whitmore accounts, everything. The full architecture of holdings, legitimate and otherwise, 6 provinces worth of financial infrastructure that was, she quickly realized, considerably more complex than Victor had understood. She worked from an office in the Westmount building. Nobody commented on her cardigan. Nobody mentioned the granola bars she kept in her desk. One of the men who'd been in the conference room, who turned out to be named Prosper and to have a dry sense of humor and a habit of leaving coffee outside her door without being asked, told her on her 3rd day that Mr. Dre didn't run the kind of operation that made people feel small. He has enough of that from the outside, Prosper said. Doesn't need it from his own people. She looked up from her screen. I'm not his people. Prosper considered this. Not yet, he said, and left. The thing she noticed, gradually, was the way Callum watched her work. Not intrusively. He had his own office at the end of the hall and the door was usually closed and she didn't see him more than twice a day, usually. But when he came into the room, to look at a document, to ask a question, to bring her tea with the specific quiet of a man who had decided she should have tea, and wasn't going to make an announcement about it, he always paused. Like he was recalibrating something. Like she was consistently not quite what he expected, and he was trying to understand why. She found the second fraud layer in November. It wasn't Victor this time. It was someone older, more patient, someone who had been running a quiet diversion from the Western operation for the better part of a decade. The routing was elegant, almost too elegant, the kind of elegance that was itself a signature if you knew how to read it. She brought the documentation to Callum at 8 in the evening on a Wednesday, when the office was empty and the building had gone quiet outside and the first snow of the season was coming down past the window in long, slow diagonals. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Reeves, he said, and the name was flat and very cold. He's been careful, she said. But he got comfortable. The intervals started shortening in August, see here and then here, the account rollover timing stopped varying, pattern recognition. She paused. It's not airtight. You'd want a second review before. How long have you known? I confirmed it tonight. He looked at her. The snow outside made the room quieter than rooms usually were, that particular hush of a Canadian November, the city going soft under the first serious weather of the season. I want you to know, he said, that what you did, this is not what I hired you to do. I know. I hired you to manage accounts, to provide documentation for the Hulse case. I know. You found Reeves because you were paying attention to something you weren't required to pay attention to. I find things, she said. It's not something I do on purpose. It's just, the numbers don't lie. They don't have loyalty. They just describe what's happened, and if you look at them long enough, they tell you everything. Callum was quiet. The snow came down. In the hallway, she could hear Prosper's voice on a phone, distant and unhurried. "Victor's lawyer made a formal claim this afternoon," Callum said. "He's produced a document manufactured, I would stake everything on it, that places your signature on a performance improvement plan from last January." She felt it, the cold, particular drop of that. He forged a PIP. He forged a PIP. His jaw was tight. "His legal team is claiming you've had a history of errors and that the Cayman documentation was your attempt to shift blame ahead of a termination that was already in process. Can you counter it?" "We can try, but it requires the original HR system data from Whitmore," she said, unaltered. "If the document was forged, the metadata won't match the HR system's timestamp architecture. Whitmore used a proprietary system that embeds creation data at the server level, not the document level. If his lawyers produced a document dated January, the server logs will either confirm it or show it was created last month," Callum said. 3 weeks ago at the earliest," she said, based on when he would have known he needed it. He looked at her for a long time. "Nadia," he said, "the Whitmore server data is not something I have access to through conventional channels." "No," she said, "but I do." She pulled up her laptop. "I kept admin credentials from when I was running the audit infrastructure in 2023. They haven't cycled them. I checked." The something not quite a smile came back. Stronger this time. "Of course you did. Give me 20 minutes. She gave herself 18. The server logs were unambiguous. The document Victor's lawyers had submitted as evidence of a January performance review had been created on October 31st at 11:47 p.m. from an IP address registered to a law firm in Old Montreal. The original HR system contained no record of a performance improvement plan for Nadia Orell at any point in her 4-year employment. She sent everything to her lawyer first. Then she printed 3 copies and handed one to Callum. He read it once, set it down. "This is the whole case," he said. "This is Victor's case," she said. "He built it on one forged document, and he forged it late on a Halloween night, which means he was scared and rushed and used his own law firm's IP instead of something untraceable. Victor Hulse has never once been the smartest person in his own room," Callum said, and there was something in his voice that was less about Victor and more about everything that led to this moment. 4 years, a side entrance, a comment about clutter, a granola bar in a jacket pocket. "No," she said. "He just made sure everyone around him knew it." The Hulse case resolved in February, in a courtroom in downtown Montreal where the February light came in through the high windows at a low angle and made everything look more serious than it already was. Victor's lawyers withdrew their counterclaim on the second day of proceedings. When Nadia's lawyer introduced the server metadata and the IP documentation and the complete history of the Cayman subsidiary routing, which turned out to involve not just Victor but 2 of his former colleagues and a shell company in Delaware that had been active since 2019. Nadia sat in that courtroom and watched Victor Hulse realize, with the specific expression of a man to whom consequences are genuinely new, that the detail work had been paying attention the entire time. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt accurate. Like the numbers had finally been allowed to describe what had actually happened, and all she'd had to do was hold the space for that to occur. Callum was not in the courtroom. He was in Vancouver on business, which was appropriate, and he sent Prosper, who sat 2 rows back and left at the lunch recess without speaking to her. He texted her at 4 that afternoon, "Heard." "Well done." She responded, "The numbers did the work." His response came an hour later. The numbers had helped. She was standing outside the courthouse on de Maisonneuve, coat pulled against the February cold. The city going about its business in the way cities do when you've just done something that felt enormous, and the world has declined to pause for it. Her breath was visible in the cold air. The plane trees along the street were bare and black against a grey sky, and a streetcar went past, and a kid on a bicycle narrowly avoided a cab, and an old woman was arguing with a parking meter. Her phone rang. "Where are you?" Callum asked. "Outside the courthouse, alone." Prosper left. A pause. "I'm 3 hours out of Trudeau. Don't go home yet." She thought about saying she was tired. She thought about saying she had things to do, plans, a life to return to now that this part was over. She thought about the side entrance and the clutter comment, and the version of herself that would have, 4 months ago, said of course and meant as you prefer. "I'll be at the Westmount office," she said. "I have the Reeves secondary documentation to finish." "You don't have to." "I know," she said. "I want to." He landed at 8:15. She heard him in the hallway at 9, heard him stop outside her office door before he knocked. That pause, the recalibration she'd come to recognize, the specific moment where he remembered to be careful with her. She looked up. He was still in his travel clothes, coat not yet off, and he looked tired and less managed than he usually looked, the silver at his temples catching the office light, the scar along his jaw. "You should have told me you were going to be in court alone," he said. "I had my lawyer." "That's not." He stopped, came into the room, sat down, not at the meeting table but in the chair across from her desk, the way someone sits when they're not there to conduct business. "You're not just an accountant I hired, Nadia. I think you know that." She looked at her screen, at him, at her hands. "You built something," he said. "Over 4 years in a place that treated you like furniture, and then, in 4 months you rebuilt it somewhere else. And you did it so quietly that I didn't realize until Prosper pointed out that you'd reorganized the entire Western account structure while you were ostensibly just reviewing Reeves. It needed restructuring. I know it did. Nobody had told me." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and looked at her with the river eyes, the February ones, the ones that were dark and cold, and also somehow she'd come to understand, always paying attention. "Victor Holtz spent 4 years telling you what you were worth. What do you actually think?" It was a strange question to ask in a Westmount office at 9:15 on a February night with the Reeves documentation spread across the desk and the snow starting again outside the window. It was also, she thought, the right question. "I think," she said slowly, "that I'm very good at what I do. I think I was good at it in a place that needed me to be invisible. In order to keep doing things I should have reported earlier. I think I let myself be called detail work because the alternative felt too loud. And now? Now I have the Reeves secondary documentation," she said. "And after that I'm going to suggest a restructuring of the Prairie's holding accounts that's going to save you approximately 8% annually, and after that I'm going to sleep for approximately 12 hours. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The dinner I owe you, you don't owe me dinner." "The dinner," he said, "I want to take you to. There's a difference." He stood, finally took his coat off, hung it over the back of the chair, after the Reeves documentation, and after the 12 hours, and the Prairie's accounts, and the Prairie's accounts. She turned back to her screen. He went to his own office. At 10:30, Prosper appeared with coffee, 2 cups, without comment, and left again with the particular tact of a person who understood the room. The snow came down past the window. The numbers described what had happened. And in a building in Westmount, on a February night in Montréal, Nadia Orell finished her documentation, sent 3 copies to 3 different secure locations, and thought about the fact that she had somewhere between a granola bar and a server log and a February courtroom, stopped being the person who used the side entrance. She wasn't sure exactly when it had happened. That was all right. She was good at finding things. She'd figure it out.